thought we'd do is just give you some of the stats on state of the market to level set us all on where things stand today and a little bit of a view moving forward. And as you can see, first slide here is venture financings over the last 5 years across the U.S. And as you can see, it's been 15, 16, 17 have been pretty healthy years in terms of venture financing for the biotech sector. And it's coming off of some pretty drought-laden years from 08 through 12. So there was a lot of pent-up demand or pent-up supply, I should say, that came into play in the kind of 12, 13, 14, 15 timeframe, and it's built from there. And there's been pretty good returns that have been associated with the investments in the venture sector over the last few years as a result of the activity in the capital markets as well as exits that have been available. This is just looking at it on a little different basis. It's looking at it from stage of development, and you can see that over that 5-year period, the preclinical component has been what's been dominant, and that's Series A, Series B type of investments have been the strongest segment of the market. Not surprising for the venture community. That's kind of the sweet spot for investing. Much less invested in the later stages. I suspect that when you look at phase 2 and beyond, that's more associated with companies that are financing alongside IPOs or right in advance of IPOs. This is looking at it, the next slide is a Midwest financing over the last 5 years. And as you can see, it's been picking up, but it's still significantly under 10% of the overall amount that has been invested across the U.S. So the market in the Midwest for life sciences, for biotech, is still pretty nascent, and which has been the case in my career. I'm from Chicago, lived here, have struggled with the fact that there just hasn't been a market in biotech over my career path. But there are some things that need to change. We were talking about this before. Capital formation is one of the biggest components of that. There just isn't the pools of capital in Chicago that's supported the development of the sector. My thesis always was that it was all going into the Merck and the board before, but there's where the risk capital was. But anyways. And then this just looking at stage of development, similar message, a little more heavy on the phase 2 segment and versus across the U.S. And IPOs, you can see that 2014 was an extremely strong year for IPOs. If you go back and you look at this over 10 years, 2014 was one of the best years on record ever, and 15 was very strong. And it dropped down in 16, and it's come back a bit in 17. And so but if you look at 17 on a kind of historical basis, it's a good year. You're just seeing some very strong years in 14 and 15 that are kind of the outliers in the data. And looking at it by stage of development, not surprising when you see human proof of concept data in the IPO marketplace. That's where the public market investors can get comfortable, and so that's where you see a lot of the financing get done. Less so on the earlier stage stuff. Licensing's been a pretty constant stream over the last several years in terms of numbers. We didn't look at dollars because it's really hard to create an apples-to-apples comparison with dollars in licensing. But it is I think the data that's coming out of here that's interesting is if you look down at the bottom, the development stage or the research stage, discovery stage deals have picked up as a percentage overall. So we are seeing activity at an earlier stage in the marketplace on licensing versus what's happened historically. And we can talk that a little bit as we move forward here. And then just number of deals by stage, and there it goes. It proves it out in the preclinical. We've seen more of that happening. And then M&A. This is looking at number and value through the 5-year period. And what's interesting is you've had some strong years here in 15 and 16, and down in 17. And this kind of brings it home when you look at, well, in 17, the deal that really drove this is Kite, and in registration. And so at 11.4 billion, if I'm not mistaken, out of that 16 billion. So that, is skewing the data. Otherwise, it's extremely low on a relative basis versus prior years and over the 10-year period that we've seen. And you can look at stage of development. And again, interesting in phase 2. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, Scott, in terms of the dynamics behind that. So, what you see is this companies like ourselves and AbbVie and other, once we see that phase 2 proof of concept human data, that really becomes the risk mitigation factor that causes us to step in and play a much larger role in the company's future. That's what we're looking for.
No, absolutely, Bob. I mean, we'll talk about it. It's interesting, though, some of the numbers shown as we discussed. We are starting to go to earlier stages with different deal structures that may allow us to partner up even in the the phase 1 or the preclinical stage, and we can get into that more. But certainly, I mean, having that human proof of concept really gives you something to run with and really assess what the value of this asset going to be when it finally gets out to patients.
So maybe we can drop right into questions then. But I guess one other point though is on valuations. If you go back into what's happening in the slide deck, anyways, what you've seen as you look at the marketplace right now, the BTK this year, which is a market cap weighted index, is up about 26% year to date, which is on a historical basis, fantastic performance. And the NBI, which is a different way of measuring it. It's not market cap based. It's share based, and it's up 60%. And the NBI tracks more development stage companies as opposed to the larger cap biotech companies like the Amgens of the world. And so you're seeing this. I mean, 60% up this year is just fantastic performance. And in fact, it was up even more than that about a month ago, and it's come down since that point in time. And so what we've seen is this focus on high science in the marketplace, and the companies that are involved in high science, whether it's gene editing or gene therapy or targeted therapies, they've seen just spectacular rises in their valuation over the last couple of years. Company in Chicago here that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, Avexis, is a great example, which went public on February 10th of last year at $20 a share. The stock's trading at 94 and change today, and its market cap is $3 billion. And they're a development stage company, working in a very exciting therapeutic area, very exciting technology space. But at $3 billion, it's an interesting valuation as the company looks forward. And when you look at that in terms of, okay, what's that portend for the marketplace? Over 25 plus years of looking at this marketplace, I've lived through a lot of different cycles, and we're up at the top end of one of these cycles as likely status of the market today. So at some point, it will correct, valuations will come back down, and the environment for raising capital investing will change from where it's at right now. But in today's environment, it's a great environment to be raising capital if you've got interesting technology and you've got a good line of sight into a therapeutic. And it provides a great environment to be starting up and getting companies started. So maybe with that we can just ask a couple of questions, and maybe Scott, you can start out with just providing the audience an overview of how AbbVie approaches early stage investing, in the discovery, research, early clinical stage, and just give us an overview.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So look, as AbbVie, obviously, we're a large company, and it's critically important for us to find ways to keep our pipeline vibrant. And while we have very productive labs internally, at the rate that science is progressing, most of the good ideas that are going to happen outside the walls of our headquarters or our sites on the coasts. And so We look at investing as one of many ways to help us gain access to some of the most promising innovation from outside of our labs. It can really make a difference in the therapeutic areas that we're particularly interested in. And so our venture group, while again, it's a venture capital investment group, our primary remit is not to hit a certain financial return metric, but rather, again, to invest in technologies that complement our work in oncology, neurodegenerative disease, autoimmune inflammatory disease, and through that investment, work with the boards of these startup companies to help these companies to grow, to achieve their short and medium-term development objectives, and hopefully end up at a point where if the science is successful and we've built a strong relationship, that these types of opportunities could become part of AbbVie's pipeline. We just had a recent example, a company called Elector that we invested in that is looking at the role of neuroinflammation in neurodegenerative diseases. And through the relationship that we built through our awareness on both sides of what both companies are trying to do, thought there was a really good fit and did a licensing deal on two targets from Elector. So again, we're not looking at venture investing as a direct conduit to business development. Rather, a lot of it is just getting out and being able to meet with people like you, our fellow institutional VC investors, tech transfer offices out of the university, to just really get a good sense of what's out there. How can we work with you to help it grow and perhaps ultimately partner up to bring these things to patients?
So Scott, what was the spark that led to the investment in Elector? I mean, how did it actually happen?
Well, it's interesting because, again, a lot of corporate VC groups will say they're agnostic and they're using VC to sort of explore white space, areas that the company is not in. We're actually the exact opposite. We're very focused and want to invest in things that we know, because we've worked very hard since we launched AbbVie 5 years ago to build capabilities in those 3 areas that I mentioned are most important to us, from discovery through market access and everything in between. And so we work very closely, since I came from R&D, worked very closely with R&D to get a sense of exactly what is their strategy, how are they thinking of building a pipeline, and then we have some very targeted things for. And neuroinflammation, frankly, was one of the sort of the pools that we're fishing in when it comes to addressing neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So it's a very kind of surgical precision approach. Now, you have to be careful because, as we oftentimes know, innovation may start in one place and then go to another. And so if we can see a certain technology or biology that could play a role in areas that we're interested in, but maybe the proof of concept makes more sense in a rare disease, and AbbVie's not a rare disease company, that's not going to stop us from investing and working with a company.
Great. And Peter, can you give us an overview of Deerfield's approach to early stage investing?
Sure. I mean, Deerfield, almost a quarter century old. Until probably the last 5 years, there was, on the private side at least, we really didn't do early stage investing. And on the public side, they've been very active in biotech for a couple decades. But our first funds that we raised privately were in 2007, I think. Those were mostly to support the public investments we had. Literally 4 or 5 years ago, we started looking at really diversifying our portfolio. We raised $3 billion in the last 2 years, and we earmarked about $1.5 billion of that toward early stage investing. So that's everything from seed financing, Series A, all the preclinical. So we have decided, now that we're managing $8 billion or $9 billion total, we really need to diversify our portfolio, and it's important to go early. And I think that some of our decisions about going early, as we talked about earlier, are just valuations. When companies are further along, they're just out of whack in some cases. So we said we want to partner very early with founder scientists or with young companies. And in the last 2 years, we've put quite a bit of capital to work. And I think that we publicize every transaction on our website, And we just recently publicized a couple academic collaborations, one with Johns Hopkins recently in the Broad. Bridge Medicine is a good example last year. So we're looking at academic collaborations so that we can get in early, work closely with the universities, and we also establish relationships with new companies, and often those are companies that we actually form when we meet founder scientists. And we have a large investment team on the private and public side at Deerfield, and we're agnostic to therapeutic category, so when we find something that's truly novel and we leverage our in-house market research capability, which is 40 or more people, to really understand the market opportunity, we'll begin to work with a team very, very early to help really create that business plan and invest early. And when we do a seed financing, we do it with the expectation that we're going to pursue a Series A with them as well, and we like to do it ourselves.
Can you expand a little bit on the structure of the academic collaborations that you've recently put in place?
Sure. The Johns Hopkins transaction, the Broad transaction are good examples, and I think the way it works is the university and Deerfield basically come together and create a translator or a new company that is dedicated to move projects forward. It's a shared or co-owned entity. The economics are shared. That the goal is for the university to bring projects to us that are exciting, and we have equal representation on a JSC. The projects are evaluated and we move them forward. Deerfield funds it, and the goal is to move it forward to either out-license or to spin it out to a Deerfield NewCo. But the real key here is, as opposed to some of the industry collaborations where they might be focused on a certain segment, or that might be basically the industry partner may basically pay the university for an option to look at things first. We really are jointly looking at every opportunity at the same time. We provide market research, insight into commercial viability ultimately down the road. They bring us the projects and the PIs, and it's really a partnership until we monetize the asset together.
Is this around a technology, or is it around a molecule?
It can be around. It's typically around the potential therapeutic, and we can work with therapeutics. We can work with medical devices or even healthcare IT. So it works with all three categories. And as at Deerfield, we split our investment probably half therapeutics, and the other half is divided between medical devices and IT. So we really build these partnerships. They tend to be dominated toward therapeutics. That's where a lot of the R&D in the universities seems to be focused. But we can be flexible in terms of how we finance going forward.
And the metrics that drive the investment on kind of the back end, return on investment and structuring issues, can you expand a little bit?
Yeah, we can. I can talk just kind of generally Deerfield overall from the private fund side, because it really would be no different for a one-off project that we're investing in early, or if it's through a collaboration. We're very data-driven, and we like to be very early, and I think that we look for opportunities that if it's a high-risk early-stage opportunity, I mean, there's no specific formula, but we might need to see 3, 5, 8 times kind of MOI, multiples of investment for our return. It's a portfolio approach, and I think that these academic collaborations we're putting in place and all the other seed financing we're putting in place, we know that not all of them are going to make it, so we are participating very proactively with as many partners as we can, because we know some will be wildly successful and others will be not as successful.
So can you generalize on the investment horizon?
We have very long-lived or long life funds. We typically will have a 4 to 5 year investment period, and typically the funds are 10 years, but we do.
So you're investing the money over that 4 to 5 year period.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then we expect that we kind of set it up as a 10-year fund, but then we include renewals because life science is not the fastest thing, and we have some of our older funds. We just keep extending them as necessary, but we understand life science and we understand you need a long time.
Right.
So we often will not even use the 4 or 5 year period investment period because we'll just raise another fund. So
Yeah.
we're usually pretty active in the first 1 to 3 years, and then the rest of it's.
But it's not uncommon for those exits to occur beyond the 10-year life of a fund.
Some projects, most of them are out before 10 years, but there are some that just take extra time. So it does happen, and we anticipate that in the beginning. Our investors understand that from the beginning.
How do you look at it, Scott?
Yeah, so the way we do it is we don't have a dedicated fund, discrete fund per se. We're investing off our balance sheet, but we target deploying a certain amount of capital to new deals as well as existing and follow-on. So the other thing is, since we don't have a specific return metric on any given investment, we're certainly mindful of valuations, but we're able to really load ourselves over on the left side of the slide, with regard to very, very early stage opportunities, where a target may still be in the process of being validated. There may not be any chemical or biologic matter in place yet. But, I think via VP, we're trying to pick things where we think the science is sufficiently robust and the patient opportunity sufficiently compelling that, we acknowledge many of these are not going to go the distance, but those that do, will have the kind of return metrics that Peter's looking for as well. So,
right.
We found that, we typically co-invest with institutional investors like Deerfield, and that, our priorities and objectives are aligned in that regard.
And how active are you in the investments? Is it just a board seat? Is it advisory to the company?
It's both. So we take both a board observer as well as voting board seats. And, look, you can obtain capital from a large number of sources if you have good science. What we work to provide is that consultative option to the company. If you're interested, we can connect you with all of the, the broader expertise that AbbVie has. It's kind of similar to what you do with the Deerfield Institute, I think, Peter. Mm-hmm. Either to answer a very specific tactical question, how do you design a toxicology study, or how does AbbVie think about the market in inflammatory bowel disease, and what do we think are the needs that still aren't appropriately addressed with current therapies. And we found the companies to be very, very receptive to those types of conversations.
Scott, you just mentioned the Deerfield Institute. Peter, you want to give a little background on that?
Sure. I think it's an important differentiating feature at Deerfield. When you think about Deerfield, there are kind of three pillars. One is the investment capability that we have, which is just the funds that we've raised. An important differentiating factor is that we have the Deerfield Institute, which of our 110 employees, I think over 40 of them are market research focused. That includes everything from payer analysis, epidemiology, biostats, IP. It's a full effort in-house that originally was created to inform our own decisions about any investment that we would make, in public or private. And we now leverage that with all of our portfolio companies. So anyone that we work with, that all of that market research is available for any academic collaboration, for any portfolio company that we're working with. And then beyond that, the investment and the institute, we have a foundation that is really important for all of us. But it's employee money that we basically put back into healthcare, pediatric healthcare. And then we have an operations team. So when we do work with new teams or create new companies, we have our own back office, accounting, HR, IT, everything that a new company needs can be basically handled by one of our groups at Deerfield. So when we just last week finalized an agreement with 5 academic co-founders, and these are brilliant folks who have a great idea, but very little business experience, and we're able to basically create the company and set it all up and bring in a lead CEO type person to work with them right off the bat. So we have money, but we're also very focused on providing every resource that we can to make the portfolio company successful.
In the room before we got started here, we were talking about some factors that we're taking a look at in the marketplace that are really driving our decisions, and one of them was looking out into the commercial marketplace. Either one of you want to jump on that and run with it?
Yeah, I mean, I could just, it's more of how we leverage the Deerfield Institute. I think, we have most of the investors at Deerfield are MDs or PhDs. I'm not one of those, so I rely on my colleagues a lot. But I think when we always start with the science, and if someone on our team is excited by a novel new technology or new opportunity, that gets us started, and we really try to leverage our market research capability early on, and we do this with academic collaborations as well. So when those initial decisions are being made about what projects should move forward, we leverage all of our capability early on in the relationship to help founders understand where we're headed, academic partners understand where we're headed. So I think that might be what you're getting at.
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
I mean, I absolutely agree with Peter. I mean, one of the things that we think is important is either, that a founder scientist is aware or open to those types of explorations of what therapies are out there, and as important, what therapies are emerging for a given disease state. And really, asking the question, okay, maybe, gene silencing, really cool, it's a novel technology, but how would that gene silencing, if you're applying it to, let's say, BCL2, why is it going to do a better job than our oral BCL2 inhibitor, Venclexta, that's already out there and serving patients? So, we love the science too, but we want to make sure that we understand that the science is going to do something for patients that current or emerging solutions aren't necessarily addressing. And I think it's critical at an early stage, because some of the decisions you make about how you're going to advance are going to be based on, what is your target. I was fortunate to work on AbbVie's HCV therapies, and we just had a new one that came out this year. But we made the decision, God, I remember, probably 5 to 7 years ago, about what should be the profiles of the candidates coming out of discovery based on what we thought the competition might look like at this point. And I mean, it's a high hurdle, but if you're looking for those pharma deals, incrementalism is a lot more challenging, because if you're the sixth one with a particular target, and I'm going to have a 5% efficacy or safety difference, that backloads all the risk to very large phase 3 trials, where innovative science with new targets and large effect sizes, again, it's great for patients, and it's a little easier, at least for a company like ours, to be able to envision. I mean, again, both types of innovation are important. I'm just saying, with regard to what we're doing in ventures, how we're thinking about it right now.
And I think about it in the seat I sit in. We probably review somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 opportunities a year for either acquisition or licensing or investment. And if I were to generalize, why do 299 of those fall out? It's going to be because of, it's going to be a mix of the commercial marketplace, just looking into it, even though it may be a phase 1 compound, looking at what's the competitive lineup in the marketplace, what are the programs that are in development today, how do they all stack up, looking at what do we expect the safety and efficacy profile to be on those products that are in development. We then look into the marketplace, and we're trying to determine what's happening in the pricing environment for these drugs today. Where is it going to be 5 years from now when the product gets into the marketplace? And I think that's a linkage that is not made a lot of times. That pricing environment is so dynamic right now. There have been so many changes that have occurred probably more in the last 3 years than in the prior 30. And so how is that going to move as we move forward? It's going to continue to change. It's a very dynamic situation. So we have to be thinking about that when we're looking at these possibilities. What is going to happen with pricing on these products? What's that going to result in terms of return on investment? And then I'd say, so that's one big category why investments fall out. The second is just looking at the clinical data. Does it stack up? Are there endpoints that the FDA or other regulatory agencies are going to buy into and actually be able to approve off of them? And then the third piece is, does the science stack up? And lastly, it would be people, which I think are really the four big points.
Bob, I think you bring up a really good point too about what kind of endpoint. We're talking about this the target validation stage, but I mean again, having an eye to the finish line, and oftentimes I'll find people who haven't necessarily worked in a regulatory context will think, well, why can't I get approved on this endpoint? And it's really because, I'm not saying precedents can't be changed, but you have to be aware of what has the FDA approved on, or if in this particular disease state, or if you're looking for a therapy for a novel disease state, willingness to engage very early on with the FDA to help drive those endpoints, because it may be the endpoint you're looking for, may be great for initial proof of concept, but then I call it kind of that translational leap of faith, right? So if you got a drug that decreases amyloid, in your brain for Alzheimer's disease, we know the FDA is not going to approve on that. It's going to be ultimately on a cognitive and functional outcome, and how confident are you in kind of that translational leap of faith from that sort of biochemical marker to what you ultimately have to show a regulator.
Right. I mean, there are this multitude of issues that we're clicking through to get to a yes decision, and it falls out along the way for a whole host of reasons. But the big ones, and I actually think that one of the biggest ones also, and one that's not as probably well appreciated when you're going in and you're developing a technology and a program, but the quality of the people that are around that are going to be the differentiator a lot of times between success and failure. I don't know, Peter, you're shaking your head.
Totally agree. I mean, I think that everything you said is correct. I mean, the science is what hooks you.
Yeah.
But in terms of getting from that first hook to getting a deal closed, it's making sure that you have a healthy, productive collaboration. I think that's key here. I mean, every deal where we invest, I personally know I'm going to be owning this and living with this for the next 4, 5, 6, who knows how many years. And we have to be really comfortable with a partner who's very collaborative and well aligned with us. So if it's not a good fit, it's not going to work. So I totally agree.
Absolutely. I mean, just in the short time I've been doing this, we have walked away from deals where the science looked great, but just that bilateral chemistry and that alignment of vision we just couldn't get to. And actually, I mean, as large pharma move more and more away from the straight out licensing and acquisition, when I started, it used to be, okay, we'll bring the asset in, and then my youthful arrogance, yeah, we'll clean up the problems. I mean, now, first of all, I want to be working with the people who brought the technology forward, because they know a lot more about it than I do. Granted, in the large pharma, again, we can bring the value on some of the that we've talked about, but we're going more towards forget even the equity investments, these option deals, where the company will keep things progressing for a much longer time until it hits a certain inflection. And then we may take more operational leadership on it. So just more and more of these relationships across all spans of investing in business development are becoming increasingly important.
How do you manage that at AbbVie? From, kind of on the ground, these relationships that have to be put in place and then fostered.
Yeah, so look, on the venture side with smaller companies, I think it's more straightforward. It is certainly, those board dinners. It's amazing how much relationship building you can do on those. Just getting to know people and building trust. For some of our larger scale collaborations, when we're working with Boehringer Ingelheim or Genentech, we actually have a formal alliance management department where there are individuals on both sides that almost work as ombudsman, trying to make sure that we can get a win-win on both sides, and really understanding what the issues are when things are getting charged between two R&D organizations. Really act as diplomats to help work through that.
Right. An interesting question here. How do you avoid overpaying for a company in a hot therapeutic area like oncology? What makes something a good deal for you?
That is a tough one. Look, we were talking earlier, in oncology in particular, I mean, AbbVie's done some large deals recently. It was on the development side when we did the Pharmacyclics deal to gain access to Imbruvica. There was a lot of doubts. That thesis appears to be playing out the way that we would have predicted it. Now we're facing it with Stemcentrx, another acquisition that we did, where we're still in the development stage, but there's still that question. It's very easy. I mean, as you know, to get just into that kind of frenzy, like, oh my God, we gotta have this. I remember in HCV, again going back to that. Gilead had the nucleotide class, and then everyone started thinking, oh my God, we got to get that class. And I tell you, even though our strategy was built on going forward without it, man, that was tough when you saw the Mercks and the BMSs of the world paying billions, and you just go, boy, I hope we got this right. It's just very easy to get pulled along into that frenzy. But I think, first of all, making sure that you're not desperate. And, I've been in situations there too where, okay, you've got a short-term problem, with revenues, and you just feel like you have to have something to plug a gap. Again, the more you're doing some of these early stage deals to keep a sustainable pipeline, the less likely you are to be forced into some of these moves of desperation. But again, when you've got one of these real hot areas, with large rewards, and there's only a few competitors, it's easy again to fall into that psychology that there's certain key assets that without them you're not going to be able to make a go of it.
I mean, we fight that also in our business, and what we've done is we've just set up some really strong guideposts and maintained a discipline around those guideposts. And one of it is we set up this, we call a matrix of metrics, and it's all these return characteristics that look at the investment just on the cold hard numbers. And we did it on purpose so that we had these checkpoints that we were looking at so that we couldn't get caught up in the emotion, but rather stick to the cold hard analysis. But then we complement that also with a broader look at what's happening, and we can deviate off of that. But then it's really looking out into that marketplace about what's happening in the commercial marketplace, and then trying to read that back into whatever stage of development the asset is. I mean, you look today and you look at the numbers in the gene therapy and gene editing and the high science areas that we were talking about before, and you could get caught up in that. But if you really try to do the analysis and you look at the fundamental value associated with these programs, there's a big disconnect that exists today, and it's a dangerous one if you're actually sitting inside those companies.
Yeah, and so, Bob, absolutely. I mean, we take a similar type of analysis when we're looking at that, and yeah, if that disconnect is just too big, we walk.
Yeah, well, and if you think about it from the other side, if you're sitting on the board of directors of one of these companies that's in the space, and you ask your banker to go do the valuation analysis, and they come in and your stock's at 50 and it comes in at 25, what are you going to do? And it's that's not uncommon in this kind of a marketplace where you're now assigning 50% of the value to the company to the pipeline, to the upside that's unidentifiable. And what you're doing is you're just hoping and praying someone doesn't come in and put a bid on you, because you don't have a lot of room to say no at that point.
And just a couple of comments. Just how do you kind of modulate when there's a frenzy, because we sit down every morning at 8:30, all the partners, and it's the public and the private and private focused investors, and so we hear frenzy every day. I mean, we're constantly hearing about, we'll look where XYZ is trading. On the private side, where I spend my time, we are incredibly data driven, very disciplined. So maybe, I don't know if we have a matrix of metrics, but we, every opportunity, everything we look at is analyzed, 3 ways. And I think what also helps is when you have 25 or 30 years of experience in the room, these cycles come and go. So when someone who's newer to the business is kind of caught up in the frenzy, one of the partners will correct us really quickly and make sure that we're stepping back and really thinking long and hard about what we're doing.
So here, the question here is, do you foresee a continued investment in genomics and gene therapy technologies?
I personally don't do any. I know our public folks continue to talk about it every day.
I think it's moved from the private market to the public market at this point for those technologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So.
Look, I think these are going to be tractable approaches scientifically for certain diseases. I mean, certainly these monogenic diseases of metabolism or hematology. I think the question that everyone's still kind of working around, Bob, to get back to some of your things, is what is the access and the pricing going to look like on this, and then how do you kind of justify the valuation there? I mean, with Spark and their ophthalmic gene therapy, I mean, is a one-timer $1 million? How is that going to fly? And I'd like to hope that we're going to evolve to a point to be able to manage these high-value therapies, how to be able to pay for them. But it's a little challenging right now in the U.S. particularly. And I mean, Bob, Coles and Newcastle, please speak to this since CBO. You think about this a lot more than I do. It's the R&D guy, but just how to be able to even get into any kind of a annuity stream when people are flipping payers from public to private.
And the average person on a plan is what, 2 years?
Yeah.
Something like that. So
I mean, so I don't have the answer. I mean, I guess maybe that is hopefully not misguided optimism that we're going to be able to figure this out. But what the size of the market is ultimately going to be for these?
you're turning
really hard
a prevalence or an incidence model into a prevalence model, and there's some really tricky aspects in terms of how big is that market, how's it going to play out. I mean, Gilead's living through that right now. Their whole HCV franchise.
We lived through it. Exactly.
Right.
I mean, and this is where, again, I mean, if you look, we all heard about Sovaldi at $1,000 a pill. I mean, if you do formal pharmacoeconomics, you could justify a price above $100,000 in terms of cost and burden of disease avoided. But it comes down to budget impact. If you're treating 200,000 people in the U.S. per year with that disease at those kind of pricing, there's just not that pool of money available. And I think that's one where, again, we've seen you come with some very unpredictable market dynamics that I think a lot of people have on their mind when you're thinking about some of these things. And then how do you value it? So there's that scientific tractability. But then, how do you think about, acquiring and making a business out of some of these?
Right. I mean, what's interesting about that argument too is before Sovaldi, Harvoni came into the marketplace, the market was really clamoring for a value-based approach, and Gilead gave it to them.
Absolutely, in spades. I mean,
said, here it is. It's justified. Pay for it.
Yeah, absolutely, on all fronts.
Right.
I mean, efficacy, tolerability, convenience. I mean, but again, it was like the perfect storm because there were so many patients. And so it's going to be, I mean, look, it's different with some of these gene therapies where you're starting out with some of these conditions where you've got fewer patients. But the question, I mean, still, that $1 million upfront for a therapy. We don't know yet, are these going to be one and done? Are you going to have to re-administer in certain diseases and certain circumstances? But in eye disease and hematologic disease, in my opinion, you're seeing some very medically relevant effects.
No, you look at efficacy rates on some of these products, it's stunning.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're curative for certain conditions, which no one was talking about that 5-10 years ago.
That's right.
Which is really just amazing. But the economic issues, financial issues that come along with it are really, really compelling and unanswered at this point.
There were a couple I know of gene therapies that were, I think GSK had one for an immunodeficiency. It was launched in Europe. There were some issues there where I think there were a very limited number of centers that could apply it, but I think they had like 2 paying customers after a year or 2 on the market. I think they ultimately ended up pulling it.
Unicure, right?
I think so, yeah.
And that's right, they ended up pulling it because
Yeah.
they just couldn't, they couldn't continue to operate with that as a problem.
Right.
But, this disconnect between the upfront cost and the long-term benefit is yet to really be addressed. And there's going to have to be some new models that come up.
You tell me about, do you
Well,
think that...
I sit on the board of Sangamo, which is one of the gene editing companies.
Sure.
So, we're wrestling through that. And it's early. We just got into the first phase 1 clinical trial for, it's the first gene editing trial in the U.S. And we'll see what happens. But the commercial issues are unanswered. There's a lot of talk and a lot of conceptual discussion around it at this point, but we've got 5 years before it's an issue. But a lot of these companies that are getting close on gene therapy are going to be facing it right now.
I'm hoping, though, again, that there's enough critical mass that, at this point, as opposed to these kind of one-off or very rare diseases, that, it's going to kind of force the issue.
It's going to force it, yeah. Because patients are going to want it.
That's
because of and parents, in a lot of cases, are going to want it. And it's going to drive some action on the payer front and the government front to do it.
I think that's the way it's going to break.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Another question that came out of the crowd is therapeutic areas that you're interested in or stay away from, and why?
We are therapeutic agnostic. We will look at everything. I think that it's really all market driven, and we look for novelty, something different. So as opposed to an industry potential partner, we're open to any kind of area that may make sense. It really is just what's different, what's new. We'll definitely leverage all our resources to evaluate the commercial opportunity to determine if it really makes sense. But if it's truly novel, I can't think of an area that we wouldn't move forward if it's going to really be game changing.
Yeah, again, we are artificially constrained because of the fact we are investing in direct concordance with our areas of R&D focus. So just because we don't invest in ophthalmology doesn't mean that, I personally think that there's not some great opportunities there. We are, I'll say, agnostic to modality, certainly. If there are gene therapies, cellular therapeutics that can address, the areas that I laid out previously, we're absolutely interested.
Yeah, and on our front, it's rare disease medicines, it's rheumatology, and then it's also ophthalmology. Again, we're constrained by the areas that we're operating today. And then, a question here is, what's up with the small amount of Series A financings?
I don't know if I can personally answer. I think from Deerfield's perspective, just the last 5 years that I've been there, we have definitely shifted earlier. So we continue to invest in Series A, but they tend to be Series A that we've already funded the seed phase. I think that 4 or 5 years ago, we were looking at Series A, Series B much more actively and much more seriously. But I think that we like to be a partner from the beginning. We like to have control. I think we were talking about board control. As an early investor who's providing all the funding, we will typically control the board. We'll typically own most of the company. And a lot of times when we were looking at Series A, B, or whatever, the valuations were just too high, and we don't necessarily want to be a participant or part of a syndicate. So I think Deerfield has shifted earlier, and maybe not necessarily away from Series A because we're still doing them, but they tend to be the deals that we've seed financed.
Yeah. I mean, actually, I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, seed and Series A, is pretty much where we are going as a group. And I thought I saw some recent Silicon Valley Bank, stats. I may not get this exactly right, but over the past year, if you look at corporate venture groups in biopharma investing, I think we're involved in about 16 to 17%, I think, of all deals. But interestingly, we're actually enriched in Series A. I mean, 1 in 3 Series A biopharma fundings has a corporate venture capital group in it. Of course, I mean, there's, it's interesting because you say Series A, but oftentimes, with a large seed or something, or a smaller seed, exactly where that Series A falls in the overall, scheme of the development cascade can vary. Again, we typically like to get, I mean, we will absolutely want to be in before something gets to clinical stage. I mean, certainly, we may come in with a development candidate, but better still if there's like a platform that can provide a range of potential candidates based on some novel biologies. That's something we really like.
Sure.
I like to
Well, I mean, look, it's really interesting because we talked about, Bob, before. I mean, the matrix of metrics, where if we AbbVie are going out to get a stem-centrics or pharmacyclics, we're going to have 100 plus 6 ways to Sunday. As a corporate strategic investor, if we're putting in a couple $1 million, and this is where I'll be really interested to hear how Peter thinks about this. It's a little more of a gut dark art kind of thing. I mean, in terms of, we've got lists of comparables that we can kind of use directionally. Okay, if it's in this therapeutic area, what have the pre-monies typically been? What kind of steps do you look at? It's a lot of gut right there. And since we, as a corporate, we typically co-invest with institutional VCs who are very, very savvy, have a lot of experience with regard to these valuations. Again, since they're primarily looking, well, not primarily, I mean, you're investing to make money. We're investing for the strategic reasons I discussed. By working with them and through our own work, we can typically triangulate onto a valuation that we're comfortable with. But I tell you, it's a lot, at least within AbbVie Ventures, it's softer than the kind of work that we used to do, for the later stage, because it can be so pleiotropic that we don't want to put the same level of analysis on it, because I mean, just in terms of people's time and opportunity cost via the amount of money that we're putting in. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear how you.
When we think about those very early stage investments, it is, in a sense, I think it's the spark. I mean, it's the science is the hook, and I think in many cases when we were talking about Series A, we too often the Series A was an evaluation we didn't feel comfortable with, and too often we didn't see the data that we felt like we needed to see. And I think that as we've moved earlier and focused on seed financing, when we think of seed financing, it's literally identifying the scientific founders and an idea, and we basically use the seed financing to build the plan. And it is a very low valuation. It's very early in the process, and I think that, Scott, you're right. I'm relying on my partners who understand the science, and they say, I really, really like this, and we think there's a very good chance, or it's a platform we really like, and then it's incumbent upon us to really create a plan so that we can get to the Series A next and move it forward.
And
Do you
if-
use sorry, Bobby. Because another way you can do this to avoid some of the valuation a priori, if you're really, really early, is convertible notes where you don't have to set the valuation a priori. I mean, you still may be fairly early when you convert, but if you don't want to get into these long debates about that spark with the founder of how should it be valued.
And we do that. You're absolutely right. I mean, seed financing, we would definitely control the board, but we may not control all the equity because we have a structured type of
But you're investing through a portfolio, so 9 out of 10 are going to fail.
Yes.
So
we expect
that's the
not all of
compensating
them are gonna-
factor.
Right. Right. We hope not quite that many. But,
Yeah, but
but we expect
if you get
a big number.
if you get 2 out of 10, you're wildly successful.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And with that, I think we've run out of time, if I'm not mistaken, unless there are any other questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.